I've got two intentions today to talk about the definition of what is teleology, teleological argument, and what is Paley's idea regarding the watch analogy. So they're the two things that I want to cover in this video. I want to talk today a little bit about teleological arguments for the existence of God, often known as the design argument or design arguments, depending on whether you think they're all the same or there's actually some substantive variation. Before I get into talking about them, I want to say why are they called teleological arguments? Why do we use that excessively long word when we've got a perfectly good phrase, the design argument? Well, teleology is, to give it the definition given in my good old-fashioned dictionary of philosophy that I bought 1,000 years ago, it says the study of purposiveness in nature. So the study of the extent to which the natural world indicates evidence of purpose or goals. So more generally, teleology is the analysis of phenomena in terms of their purpose, their goal, their telos. What are they for? What are they driving towards? What's the goal in which they want to move towards? So that's why we call it the teleological argument. In a second, I'm going to talk about the most famous example, which is Paley's example of the watch. Okay, the watch analogy. Well, Paley's the most famous way of viewing the design argument historically, I guess, is through this watch analogy, which seems to have had really long life, and considering that many people consider it to be a bad analogy. Anyway, in respect of that, imagine you're walking through a field, as you might pointlessly be, and you come across a rock. You think nothing of it. You think the rock's there because it's a field. It's got rocks in it. It's just a natural part of the environment from which we infer very little. However, were I to be walking across a Cotswold field, as I might, and I stumble across a watch, I could infer, and I would infer, and I'd be required logically to infer from the watch different things to that which I would infer from the stone. The watch shows evidence of design, hence design argument. The watch looks like somebody made it for something in a way that isn't the case with the stone. The watch was designed for a purpose. There's a point to it. It's by somebody for something. The analogy, therefore, is if we look at the universe, the world around us, it's more like the watch than the stone. The universe demonstrates to us evidence of design. That when we look at the world around us, we think, this must be for something, by someone. To quote Paley, the inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other, an artificer or artificers, people who made it, who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. So he says, we clearly can tell from the watch that it's made by somebody. It was an artificer, a nice old-fashioned word, constructed it, designed it, made it for something. And Paley tries to preempt some criticisms. He said, we would still come to that conclusion if we'd never seen a watch before. If we didn't know what a watch was or what it was for, if we'd never seen one, we'd still know that there was a big difference between the stone and the watch, that they were qualitatively significantly distinct from each other. Even if the watch didn't work properly, if it was broken, we still know that somebody made it for something. Even it being broken or being on occasion imperfect, not properly working, wouldn't stop us from thinking it's still made by someone for something. Even if there were aspects of the workings of the watch we didn't understand. If we were quite ignorant about the mechanics of the watch, we'd still understand that it was for something and had a purpose. So, Paley claims that the watch had clearly not come about from the field as a result of a set of random events that would be mad, but at some point had been made, and importantly, thinking about teleology, had been made for some point or purpose. So he draws an analogy between the watch and the natural world. Look at the world, he argues. Is it not obvious that the world is designed, that it is for some purpose? From this, therefore, we infer a cosmic designer. The world appears to have evidence of design, some argue. Paley uses some additional examples in addition to his watch analogy. The nature and the utility of nature. The fact that the natural world is so complex that things fit, as it were, just so. Of course, this is thinking in a context where we haven't got an alternative competing explanation, which we do now have in evolution. Of course, like the watch, what impresses many 18th century writers is the idea of the solar system being like clockwork, being mechanical, being predictable. A mechanistic, rule-based and predictable view of the universe matches well with the image of the watch. So the solar system seems an example. And that favourite, of course, of many historical design arguments, the human eye. How can we have got something so complicated, so marvellous and wonderful? Surely such a marvellous thing as the human eye must have been crafted by a master craftsman or craftswoman. The fact that I'm, like many of you, wearing glasses is perhaps evidence that the human eye isn't entirely perfect. Voltaire notes, of course, being sarcastic and mean, in Candide, God, what a fantastic God to put the nose just there so the spectacles do rest upon it so perfectly. It's a kind of ironic idea of everything being for the best. So that's a quick summary of Paley's watch analogy. It's there to say the world is like the watch. It shows evidence of design. Somebody made it for something. Even if you don't know what the world is for, or quite what the purpose was, or the workings of it are, it's clear, he argues, or the argument argues, that the world is there for something. And evidence from looking around the world leads us to believe that. In a moment, I'll consider some criticisms of that point of view and whether we ought to be entirely persuaded by it. Okay, finally, is the design argument as put forward in Paley's watch analogy any good? It's worth noting that there are more recent attempts to construct a design argument by people like F.R. Tennant and the whole intelligent design versions, which I won't say anything more about now. But in regards to Paley's version, well, we might be tempted to say initially it seems very convincing, but then is the universe really like a big watch? Really? Is it entirely mechanistic? Is it a good analogy? Is the world, John Hick writes in his little book Philosophy of Religion, quoting, only if the world is shown to be rather strikingly analogous to a human artifact which we know to be designed, is there any basis for the inference to an intelligent designer. So are we convinced that it's any good as an analogy? Is the world rather like something mechanical? Or is it, like Hume claims, more organic? Is it better compared to an aubergine? He doesn't use that example, I just like it, or not. I guess the killer way of thinking about it really is, are there alternative competing explanations for how the world came to be how it is? The fact that things fit in so well with each other, things rely on each other, the natural world is so well adapted. And there's a clue, the word adapted. Paley writes, in the absence of a convincing alternative explanation, we have a competing alternative explanation that for many people is very convincing. We have the evolutionary hypothesis. Might not the fact that things are well adapted and fit together so well be explained by millions and millions of years of adaptation? Many would argue that the evolutionary hypothesis is a fatal blow to the design argument, as Paley puts it. That the universe actually has perfectly capable of explaining why it is the way it is without the need to infer something external. Of course, there's a whole bunch of other criticisms of Paley's argument, is that, you know, a watch may have been built by one person, it may have been built by a whole bunch of people. So it doesn't prove, maybe if it proves anything, it doesn't, even if successful, prove a single God. It might mean diversity of beings. It doesn't prove an enduring God. Someone who built the watch may now be dead. You know, if I find a really old watch in a field here, it's pretty likely that the person who made the watch is long dead. Or, you know, God could have made the world and died. God could have made the world and moved on. It doesn't show any enduring duty of care. The argument doesn't demonstrate evidence of a good God. The world, as I encounter it on a daily basis, has got some quite pleasant things in it. It's got some quite crappy things. I was watching the news before I came in today. That's fairly depressing. You know, does that not lead us to conclude that God is not omnibenevolent at all, but actually quite malign? The whole problem of evil, which obviously we talk about elsewhere, is brought up, but even by thinking about the design argument, it says, well, if we move from the evidence of the world to a being, if we want to make an empirical argument that says this is the nature of the world, therefore there is a God, and he might or she might be like this, that seems to make the problem of evil really kind of at the foreground of our thoughts. So the kind of God it proves seems, even if it was successful, very limited. It seems to be a modest argument that would prove a designer, not a theistic being, even if it proved that. And the persuasiveness of it relies on how strong an analogy you think that is, how much you think the world kind of really does show evidence of design, and how much you think the alternative competing explanations do or don't fully explain that, in which case, do we need them? Should we not use Occam's razor and cut away things like Paley and think we don't need that kind of explanation to explain how the world is the way it is anymore?